Hey, welcome to Tech Tuesday number 53. IP talking to the Triumvirate. Hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Before we start, hopefully the saga will be over soon, but let's take a moment of silence. Here's what we're going to talk about today. First, we're going to start with a quote from James Maxwell, the, father of electromagnetic theory. And he had two questions that he'd like to ask, and I agree with them. One of them is, what is the go of it? In other words, what is the thing that makes it happen? And the next one is, what is a particular go of it? If you gave him some sort of vague answer. So we're going to talk a little bit about the watermelon again. And then we're going to see how the triumvirate can be a framework for dealing with watermelons. I'll talk about the advantages of this framework and how to use it. Alternatives, because they do exist and they might be more suitable in some cases, and various extensions. Like our friendly fox here, if you have a watermelon, it's kind of difficult for you to fit it in your mouth. And I've talked about it before and several talks about it. The point is as follows. When you get a new project, it is very complicated and too many details and parts to actually fit inside our heads. So the question for the patent attorney is, how do we approach it? And one way is actually dealing with it like a watermelon and slice it up into pieces and basically apply analytical thought. Another possibility is that we focus on some part of it and we build ourselves a structure for understanding the complexity of the watermelon. And if you're familiar with the concept of cutting nature at the joints, which I'm not going to go into, really what you're doing is you're trying to build a language to explain what's going on so that you can cut nature at the joints. And what's definitely different about this talk is I'm not going to be talking about strategy. I might be talking about understanding what you need in order to do strategy, but this talk is about how to help you understand what a particular innovation is about. And so let's start. Okay, you're sitting at your desk, somebody walks in and says, hey, I have a great new product. What should we do about IP? And there's really two different problems that the patent attorney needs to solve. And one of them is how to make sense of this product and the whole complexities that walking in through the door. And the other problem the patent attorney needs to solve is what should they be exploring? Okay, writing a patent, I believe, always involves exploring, whether it be the invention or the protection options and so on. In addition to solving these two problems, there's also tasks that patent attorneys have to do. And one of them is to figure out what is likely to be more patentable about what the client walked in with. And the second one is try to figure out, maybe together with the client, what is more likely to be valuable. So look, I built a 2x2. But even if you have a 2x2, you got to know where to start your analysis. So one option is to choose one of these four quadrants and analyze. So let's see what it looks like when you do that. first quadrant is I'm looking for something that makes sense to me and is panable. The classic way to do it as patent attorneys is to try to write a claim. Okay, that's a automatic thing patent attorneys do when they see something, is to write a claim, which is good. I have a full page on it later on, but what I want to point out is that claims are about inventions, not about innovations. And we'll talk more about that later. Another thing that some people do is they do a search. Let's see what's out there that's similar to what the client's doing. And then we know that what the client's doing is everything except for what's out there. When you do that, you have a problem calibrating what you're going to search for. We've definitely all seen searches which were either too narrow and useless or too broad and useless. Another possible direction is I try to make sense of what's valuable. So usually, not always, but usually, some critical feature that you have is valuable because the competition have to do it. And if you understand the critical features, you definitely helps you make sense of what's going on. But it's not always clear how you get from the critical feature to the bigger picture of what the client has. Last, you can try to explore for what's valuable. And that's really when you build a story about how the client's going to make money. And I love that too. The problem is that it might be a too high a detail for you to actually use to get at all the details that the client has. So first of all, what I'm proposing is to start in the middle of this 2x2, right over here, in the overlap between all four of them. And the way I propose doing that is that you look for a core example or core embodiment of what the client is doing, you make sense of it, and then you continue on from there. And obvious question is, how do you figure out what is that core embodiment? So I'm a medical device, so I'm going to start with an example for medical device, but I promise to talk about things that are not medical later on. So when I approach an invention or innovation that has to do with a medical device, I know that whatever it is a client's doing, there's a 99% chance that it has to deal with the following three issues, which are cover usually the leading issues of a medical device. One, the physiology. The medical device interacts with the physiology. Second, the technology. Some things we can do, some things we can't do. You can't make it smaller. You can't make it bigger. You can't make it stronger. You're able to make it faster. Okay, so the technology interacts with what you're trying to do with the device. And the clinical side. Medical devices are used by doctors as part of a clinical process in order to get clinical results. And the idea is that by focusing how the innovation interacts with whatever we know about in each one of these three, we can identify a core embodiment which is useful to start from and useful to continue from. And when I say interact, so you can have modifications in both directions, and sometimes you want a positive effect and sometimes you want a negative effect. I'm not going to go into it right now. But let me just give you an example from stent design, just to give you a feeling for what I'm talking about. So when you build a stent, let's say that sits inside a coronary blood vessel, how does it interact with the anatomy? So one way it interacts with the anatomy, physiology, is that in order to deliver the stent, it has to go through convoluted blood vessels. So it has to be flexible. How does it interact with the technology? You need to have materials that provide the strength you need to hold up the blood vessel, the flexibility that we just talked about, and the ability to expand inside the blood vessel. And from the clinical perspective, the device has to be easy to implant correctly with good results. Now, I'm not saying that everything the client is trying to do has all of these properties, but I am saying the opposite. I'm saying it is probably very interesting to the client to talk about the core embodiment, which is good for each one of the anatomy, technology, and clinical. So why do I have three? Legally, and I'll explain what I mean in a second, one of them is enough for panability. In other words, if I chose a particular technology for my stent, or I modified my stent in a particular way to match the anatomy, or I modified my delivery system in a particular way to help the clinical process, that is enough for panability. It's novel and it might be inventive, and it definitely, has use. And it's more than that. When people ask me what is the difference between, medical devices and other stuff, I always say that medical devices are about the interaction of the technology with the body. So that's not three. The problem is that if you only have one, it doesn't give you enough guidance when you start from the one core embodiment and try to expand. Two is better, but I believe that three is a magic number, that it helps you find a core embodiment that is not the broadest possible embodiment, but it is at the heart of what the client cares about. And if we can understand the heart, I think it's obvious, but I'll show later why you can go elsewhere. And three, of course, is more limiting, but it's limiting in a positive sense. It's limiting you to what's interesting. And if you have three, you can also start talking about the interaction between the physiology and the technology, or the clinical and the technology. And later on, I'll talk about how you can do more than three, but the typical ways that I work is after I identify this core embodiment and understand it, I then go down to two or to one, because yes, I do want to tell the client what is the broadest claim we might be able to get, but I also go up to three and more, because that allows me to identify where there's more interesting stuff to put in the patent. And I look at this adding or removing issues as a way of exploring what is patentable or potentially patentable. So how do you apply the framework? And I'll say it again, because I'm sure people will feel that I'm going too narrow. This is only about finding a good starting point. It's not about finishing, it's about starting. I first identify the three relevant issues. So obviously, if you're not doing medical devices, there are going to be different three relevant issues. After you do that, you state what it is that the product is in general terms. Then for each issue, we identify how the product is modified in order to take that issue into account. And here we go back to Maxwell. What specifically about the product is modified for what specific reason? Then we ask ourselves, how does one modification for one issue contradict or maybe support for other issues? Okay. And then we do it again because it's an iterative process. And yeah, the client can also provide input, and possibly as you're talking to the client might redefine what they're actually doing and what's actually interesting for them. Now, there's something called CK theory, which I've talked about before. Whoever's interested can look it up on Wikipedia. CK theory is a method of interactive design where you go from concept to embodiment and back. So you can see how it's relevant, but CK is used for exploring, and I'm looking to narrow the field, to more clearly define out of the entire scope of what the client believes in, what is that core embodiment? I think the right way to apply this method is by doing a dialogue. And one of the reasons you want to do a dialogue is because we have these twin evils. One of them is self-deception, that we think something is correct when it absolutely isn't. And the other one is fixation. We think that we got it and we don't actually got it. If you're familiar with this type of wall made of dry set rocks, one of the ways you do it is when you have a rock, you rub it into place, and the friction wears off all the bad parts until you have a smooth fit that you can't even fit a piece of paper in between. So that's what you expect to happen when you do the dialogue. And when I say dialogue, we actually have three different types of dialogues. So one is we're talking to the client. The second one is we have a dialogue between what we conceive of the invention and these different issues that we wanted to talk about. And the third one is when you just take the issues themselves and they have a dialogue with each other. And I want to be clear that any relationship can be complex. For example, a material for the stent we talked about can be good for interaction with tissue and bad for interaction with blood. So the idea is we want to dig in and figure out what are the details. And part of the dialogue will bring up points that need to be explored, but they will be explored later after we identify that single core embodiment that we will base our understanding on. And before I go into this example, often as you're working with a client, you expect that as your understanding of the invention changes, also the core embodiment is going to change. So if the client thinks that he's doing toys, but during the discussion and the search for the core embodiment, you realize that he's actually doing wireless information transfer, it could be that the core embodiment is going to change. It's just not just a narrowing down, you can also move. Okay, so here's a slightly more worked out example. An intramedullary nail was invented maybe in 1939, though they did find a mummy that has one. And the idea is that if you have a broken bone, you put a steel rod inside the bone. You know, a lot of bones are hollow, not really hollow, but not bony inside. So you put a steel rod inside, and that steel rod gives you immediate stabilization of the fracture, because it can't move, it has a steel rod inside. And also it allows you to have loading that you can immediately put your weight down on your foot. So anybody who has a misfortune of a elderly relative who broke their hip, today after they put one type of other of a intermedullary element inside, and the next day they expect the patient to start walking for putting a load on it. So the client walks in with this idea, a year, doesn't matter what's a year, nobody's ever done anything like this before. How do we deal with it? It's just, like I said, too complicated. So let's start cutting it down. Let's talk about what physiology is most relevant. And the answer will be the tibia, one of the bones below the knee, and that the alignment between the broken parts of the bone are maintained by the fixation, the way that the steel rod attaches to the bone. Let's look at the clinical. Where are we going to apply it? How's the doctor going to use it? The answer is he's going to use it in the ER treatment room. Okay, it's not a real surgical arena. And he's going to clean out the center and he's going to insert the nail after we position the bone fragments. Now let's look at the technology. We already know that we have to have fixation. So the technology we're going to use for fixation is the steel rod will have spikes that stick out of it and anchor. Now, just to be clear, each one of these things that I just told you has 4 or 5 different alternatives, which could be just as interesting, but we don't care. This is our core embodiment. We're not done. We do it again. Now we look at the interaction, for example, between the clinical side and the technology. And on the clinical side, we have two things to look at. One is, how does a doctor use a device? And the answer is, you put it in, it's not fixated, and then you turn a screw, which is outside the body, and that fixates it. And the second question is, how do we maintain the alignment? Because you don't want to be holding the leg in both places while you're also screwing. And the answer is, we first extend the spikes at the distal side, and then when we turn the leg, if we have to, it will turn the rod as well. So putting aside the medical device detail, what I'm trying to show you is that the client walked in with this very general idea that has many, many embodiments and many considerations. And by talking to him about the physiology, the clinical side, and the technology, and then doing another round and looking at additional interactions, we focus on just one of his embodiments. But now we understand why this embodiment is important and how it interacts with these leading issues, which are leading issues in medical devices. So we can both, and we'll show what we do with it, but we definitely understand what's going on. So how do we use it? The first use is what I've been alluding to. When we first meet a client, we want to be able to talk to them. If we identify a core embodiment that they really care about and that we understand why it's core and how it's connected to the main issues, wonderful. And one of the ways a discussion is exploratory, meaning the client will teach you what you need to know, is by talking about each one of these issues. And sometimes many clients, they need emphasis that you're not trying to write a patent only on the core embodiment. Okay? But only that you're looking for this core embodiment in order to understand what's going on. Here's another use. You want to do a patentability search. Okay, so let's say a guy walked in and he said this. Okay, and I do a search. What am I going to find? That in Egypt, 4,000 years ago, they stuck an intramedullary nail into a mummy, probably after it died, in order to give immediate stabilization and fast loading to that dead body. That is not useful. But by giving out this core embodiment, I can probably search that core embodiment. And if anybody else was trying to solve this type of problem, they probably also had to deal with these issues. So it's interesting. And more than that, if I don't find any prior art or it's far enough away, this core embodiment is not the broadest, protection you can get, but it's valuable. And I call it search distractions, okay? If what you're looking for is too broad, you get all sorts of prior art, it's not relevant. So by identifying this core embodiment and searching this core embodiment, at least step one, we answer the question, does it look like I can get an okay patent? If the answer is no, go back to the drawing board. If the answer is yes, great. Can I get a good patent? Can I block my competition? And so on. When you draft an application, anything having to do with the core or with the interaction between the innovation and one of these issues, okay, that probably details you want to have in your patent because they're more likely to give patentability, because they're more likely to be interesting to whatever people are doing. Now, I understand it sounds, kind of trivial, but I think that our task is complicated enough that even a simple framework that helps us see how to do our job can be super useful. What else can you do? Exploration. It doesn't really matter if you're exploring out or exploring in. Having these issues to guide you means that instead of, okay, let's talk about how we could change the application, how we could change the embodiment, okay, What other physiological issues does your product interfere with? What other places in the clinical process need help in order to use your product? What other technologies might you use in order to get a product which does what you say you need to do? Okay, that is much more focused questions, both for you and for the client. Talk about the future. What's going to happen in the future? That's, again, a very broad question. But by asking you, what technologies do you think are going to change, and how will they change what you're doing? Or do you expect the clinical processes to be the same? And if not, how is it going to change? Okay, again, it gives you a handle, an organization into how to analyze. There's something I call zero order panability. Okay, we're talking to a client and is this panable, is that panable? So when I started out, the answer was, let me do a search either on a super expensive database or have somebody go look in papers, and I'll give you an answer in a week or two. Today, you can quickly search online in much cheaper databases, AI databases, and so on. But when you're in the middle of a discussion, sometimes you can't even do that. However, I can tell you what is more likely to be panable and what is less likely to be panable. A rigid rod is not likely to be panable. Okay? I think we can agree. A rigid rod that has a diameter which is suitable for tibia and shape as well, and which has extending spikes, and which you screw them in from the proximal tip, and which the distal spikes extend first, I think you'll all agree is much more likely to be panable. Okay? Because it checks so many boxes. Maybe somebody did it before, okay? But it's much more likely to be panable. And a close relation to zero order panability is the words configured for. Okay, some of us use a phrase configured for without actually trying to figure out in what way is it configured for. So I'm helping you. When you write a nail, a rod configured to be put into an intramedullary channel of a tibia, so I ask you, is it the technology which is configured? Is it configured to match the physiology and or anatomy? Or is it configured in a way that it helps the doctor do it? Okay, again, it leads you on, and instead of giving you a blank page, gives you a path to do it. Two-part claims. If you don't know what to write, too many options, well, that feature which you modified in view of one of these three issues is a likely candidate. Definitions and patent applications. So I don't like definitions, but I can tell you which ones I like the least. The ones I like the least are the ones which most interact with the invention. Okay, so if I say anatomy means the shape of bones, that's not very useful if I have a device which is interacting directly with the shape of the bone. So you want to put definitions about DNA, fine, in this invention. But don't put definitions just saying what anatomy is. Be much more specific because we know that's where the device is interacting. Freedom to operate. A lot of grant givers want you to do a freedom to operate search, analysis, whatever, before you have a product. Now, we know that freedom to operate should be done when you have a design freeze. So what do you do if you don't have a design freeze? Well, one thing you can do is you can identify what your critical features are and see if anybody did them. Another thing you can do is what I'm talking about here. You can identify the core embodiment and say, let's do a freedom to operate on this core embodiment. Why? First of all, if we get a negative answer, it's a good point to start exploring from. Second of all, I can justify why getting a positive answer, you have freedom to operate in this core embodiment, has value for the company, because this is a core embodiment which has value. It ticks off all of the important boxes, and I have freedom to operate. Maybe I can't do whatever I want, but this I can do. And last but not least, we have to tell stories, whether in the patent, to investors, to ourselves. And at least we have to explain how the critical features work together. And if you consider in your mind these three main issues of physiology, clinical, and technology, it's much easier to craft a story which helps people understand what innovation is about. I promised to talk about claims, plans. And like I said, many patent attorneys have the habit of immediately writing a claim. So first of all, it's a wonderful habit because patent attorneys think in claim language, and you should be naturally writing a claim as soon as you see something. The question is, should you be trying to write a good claim? Well, claims help you decide what is inventive over known art, but they don't help you when you're trying to figure out about unknown art. Claims help organize the technical language, but they ignore the dimensions, which could be just as important, like the clinical results, which are not technical features. When you write a claim and you use term connected, coupled, attached, mounted, the term you use helps you figure out what can be designed around. But what it doesn't do is help you understand what is possible to do and what is worthwhile to do. If, on the other hand, you'd started by analyzing these issues, you'd have a better answer. Claims give you focus. They tell you exactly what to do. Unfortunately, you can get fixated on that. Okay, I know it's inventive. Now I'm going to draft a patent application on what's inventive. Claims have the positive benefit of integrating very important things like detectability, enforceability, and so on. But focusing on litigation is, I think, a bit premature if you haven't yet made sense of the invention or the innovation. Claims are difficult to draft. So how do you make the task simpler? Well, I just explained. And last but not least, claims talk about an invention. In fact, claim is a unit of invention. But the client wants not protection for his invention, but protection for his innovation, the entire thing, the product, how it's used, and so on. So I don't think claims are a good tool for improving your understanding or exploring what could be good for the client. There's another way of doing things. Let's call it problem orientation. Here you look at the problem being solved and you ask yourself, how does the different parts of the innovation help solve the problem? Nice, I do it too, but the organization it gives you is problematic. Usually you're trying to solve more than one problem. When we talk about problems, there's internal problems and external problems. Internals are the one that are due to what you're doing, and external are what the client has. When you talk about problems, you ignore opportunity. And when all is said and done, you're going to identify an inventive feature. So that brings you back to claims. So I would say that the level of abstraction when you do problem orientation is good for claim drafting, but not always for figuring out what the client also needs. But I completely admit that the framework I just showed also isn't perfect. So there's a whole stack of them, which I'll show you in a minute. And one last thing, like I said, nearly every medical device invention that walks in through the door, I can apply exactly the same framework on. It is not true when you look at it from a problem orientation, because each invention, innovation, whatever, is trying to deal with a different problem, a different type of problem. So this framework has the advantage of being more reusable. I talked about having three, but you can definitely have more than three. And we know that the context is always multidimensional. And here I give you a list of all sorts of other ones you can consider. And perhaps more generally, there's a context. There's things that we are going to change, in other words, the inventor, and things in the world which are going to change. And of course, there's goals we want to reach. So one thing you can do is after you did three, you can add another one, say, okay, let's talk about how the innovation interacts with the future, how the innovation interacts with practicality, maybe cost, maybe how you make money, and so on. A different way of doing it, I mentioned before, I have a stack. So let's look at the stack. This word, Siphonum terra, whatever, is a family of fleas, and we know that each flea has on its back even smaller fleas. And this triumvirate can be broken down. One of the reasons why it can be broken down is the how is we do something is very context and field dependent. Just for example, if you think about technology, we talk about interaction with technology. We can talk about signal to noise if it's a communication technology. We can talk about reliability. We can talk about maturity, which become more relevant before. When we think about our friend clinical, we know that safety is very important. We know for physiology, usually interact with multiple biological mechanisms. You can ask the client what they are. And I call it uniquities, which are things that you did different because of one of these issues. And the number of things that you did different, I alluded to before, says something about how patentable your invention is and how strong it will be. And some of you might be thinking, oh, but it's going to be very narrow. If I have 5 different uniquities, it's going to be narrow. However, because each one of these uniquities relates to a somewhat different failure mode, okay, failing for safety is very different from failing for reliability. There's an overlap, I agree, but it's different. You're not actually narrowing that much each time you add a uniquity. And on the other hand, what you are doing is you're helping organize the situation in your mind because you start understanding which of these standard issues is more important, which one is less important, and how they interact with everything else. I also want to compare what I've talked about to a different triplet. When an innovator wants to innovate something, okay, he's really going on a journey in a three-dimensional space, which includes the need, what people need, the market, who, what pays, and the technology. And sometimes he develops technology, sometimes he understands the need, sometimes he create a new market, and so on. This is not the same as the triplet that I talked about, but there are definitely similarities. Okay, medical, only medical? No, not only medical. Even in medical, sometimes you have things that are not the body, like manufacturing or billing. Let's talk about software. If I were applying this framework to software, I would probably look at install base, which would replace physiology, use, which would replace clinical, and technology, which would stay the same. So if somebody came in with a new software, and I'm trying to understand what's going on here, if I understand how it interacts with the existing install base, with how people use it, and with a particular technology we have inside this innovation, I think that is going to help us find a core embodiment, and it, again, would be a good starting point. And which issues we choose have to do with the abstraction level that we're looking at. You don't always want to analyze innovation. Sometimes, yeah, you want to analyze the invention, and sometimes you want to analyze the business. Okay, what if I'm looking at the invention? Okay, I want to analyze an invention. I would look at how the invention interacts with the problem or opportunity we're trying to do, how the invention interacts with the technology, and how the invention interacts with the action. Action is that thing which does whatever it is we want done. And of course, dependent inventions are going to be different. Let's level up. Let's talk about the business itself. The client comes in with a business, and the question is, how will our IP help us? So the business is interacting with exclusivity. IP in general gives the client exclusivity. I'm not looking at a particular patent, okay? I have competitors that they impact our business, but they also interact with our exclusivity. And in the business, the most important thing is who's going to pay, because it's all about the money or not. And again, how does a business adapt itself to the people who want to pay, and how does exclusivity support that? Let's level up a bit more. I'm not just talking about the business, but about how my business is going to grow. So when my business is going to grow, in a lot of the companies we deal with, we have innovation, which is supported by IP. We have the future, which we're imagining, but we want the IP to guide us there. And we have the business model, which is changing all the time, and which you should always be thinking about IP, because you want to support your business model and prevent your competitors from either taking over the model or using it. The company itself. As you know, most startups have two products. Whatever it is they're selling, the stent or intramedullary nail, and the company itself that's also trying to sell. And the question is, our IP portfolio, okay, not an invention, not innovation, IP portfolio. And when we sell, let's talk about leveraging the IP for buyer need, which is a way to get more money. And how do you get more money? You have somebody in pain. There's a solution set, as much as possible covered by the IP, and the alternative, let's say other companies they could buy instead of you. But if the way the IP interacts with the alternatives is to make them less desirable. Okay, so again, we have this three-way analysis, again, just to find a starting point. It's not an end analysis. It's not the magic answer. In summary, I gave you a general framework for identifying a useful starting point in analysis and organization of a new thing, whatever the thing is that requires IP attention. And the framework is, we look at the intersection of an innovation or some other thing with the leading three issues. It's very valuable to help you find and score what's relevant. It is also very helpful to help make sense of what's going on so you can guide your exploration. And, you know, I showed you multiple examples at multiple different levels. So obviously for each situation, you make your own. Okay, here's an example of how I might apply it. There's a company called Pointmore, and they make things that you add on to surgical scalpels. Maybe a laser sight, a depth detector, you know, how deep did you cut, a sprayer which coagulates blood, something which analyzes what the tissue is. And at the very first step, to try to make sense of what's going on here, because like I said, this is a whole company. They're very probably 10 man years invested in that company in a field which you might not be familiar at all, and look at all these different technologies. So we can start just by looking at the product, some cool inventions, and the company itself as a product, and trying to figure out what interactions are happening here and why they're interesting. So I'm now stopping the recording.